The 1961 film West Side Story inspires nostalgia, excitement, enchantment, and perhaps a heartbreak. It deeply affected many people then and now. There is a neo-Romeo and Juliet romantic tragedy going on. The lyrics of the songs are very Sondheim, that is to say, very Sondheim good. The dances have precision, characterization, and color, never pompous. There's also Natalie Wood's stark charisma gracing the screen, Rita Moreno's unequivocal assurance, Rose Tamblin's athleticism, George Shakira's suave and vaguely sinister grace, and Richard Baymer's first love sincerity. West Side Story is set in 1950s New York City, exploring the rivalry between two juvenile street gangs, the Jets and the Sharks, and the societal consequences of an interracial love story amid a time of segregation, prejudice, and hatred. It's a movie that people love for many reasons, but just like love, it's complicated. There are imperfections. Obviously, perfection rests mostly on the eye of the beholder. In this case, the film's flaws have only come to surface in the recent years as the film ages and society progresses. Now, if you're familiar with my channel and if you read the title of this video, you know that we are here to talk about race. How West Side Story's The Sharks came to be Puerto Ricans, the casting of the film, and the stereotyping the film conceived onto Puerto Ricans and other Latin Americans, especially young men. Just so you know, up front, I won't be discussing the film's two directors, how Jordan Robbins' keen on perfection inflated the production's budget, or how Miss Wood was tricked into thinking that her own singing was going to be featured in the final cut. If you don't know, she was outrightly dubbed by Ghost voice Marnie Nixon, or how Beamer and Wood didn't get along during the making of the film. These and other details, or very enthralling in retrospect, can be found in Richard Barrios' West Side Story, The Jets, The Sharks, and the Making of a Classic. In 1948, Jerome Robbins began to play with the idea of updating the Shakespeare play Romeo and Juliet into a musical. His career had quite luster up until then, choreographing Broadway productions such as The King and I, Two's Company, Peter Pan, The Pajama Game, among other productions. Barrios writes, "The feuding Montagues and Capulets, for example, could have an equivalent in something as timely as the ongoing conflict between Jews and Catholics living on the east side of Manhattan. One of several problems with the concept, tentatively titled East Side Story, lay with its two opposing forces. Jewish-Catholic conflict had been an acknowledged problem for so many years that it had long ago turned into the butt of jokes. Even worse, it had been the subject matter of Avi's Irish Rose, the 1922 Broadway comedy that was legendary for scoring record-breaking success despite terrible reviews. Some sources, including Barrios, claim that West Side Story was conceived 2,700 miles away from New York City, San Bernardino, where, on August 21, 1955, the LA Times published a story often cited as the motivating factor. Barrios writes, "Other sources mention a Los Angeles Times article about gang violence on Olvera Street. Arthur Lawrence, who wrote the dialogue of the play, wrote in a column for the New York Herald Tribune in 1957, in Shakespeare, the nature of the conflict between the two houses is never specified. We had begun with religion, but that was dropped into the roomy swimming pool of the Beverly Hills Hotel. Instead, the racial problems of Los Angeles influenced us to shift our play from the lower east side of New York to the upper west side, and the conflict to that between a Puerto Rican gang and a polymorphous self-styled American gang. It's difficult to fathom whether the youth delinquency problem in the 1950s was an isolated issue of the minorities, which included the newly arrived flocks of Puerto Ricans. Let's take one issue at a time. The U.S. acquired Puerto Rico after the Spanish-American War in 1898, and in 1917, Puerto Ricans became U.S. citizens, but when they arrived to the mainland, they experienced second-class treatment, which we hear in the song America. Everything right in America, if you are white in America. 1946, post-war, a major wave of Puerto Ricans were coming to the mainland, lured by industrial jobs and the hopeful promise of escaping poverty, often favoring New York City, settling, according to Carol J. Oja, in large concentrations in East Harlem, and the second largest stretching from West 122nd Street to West 155th on the edge of Washington Heights. At a peak in 1953, 75,000 Puerto Ricans left the island. Oja also writes, as these demographic changes unfolded, newspaper chronicled a rash of teen violence. 5 youths displaying their prowess before a gang of 15 girls critically wounded a boy on the west side last night, reported the New York Times on March 6, 1956. 4 youths were arrested last night in the aftermath of a teen gang fight in Washington Heights, in which one youngster was fatally stabbed, declared another article on August 1, 1957. If you scout through newspapers of the major U.S. cities in the 1950s, you'll find several clips on gang-related violence. Brian Eugenio Herrera, in his book Latin Numbers, writes, within emerging contemporary understandings of youth criminality in the 1950s, juvenile delinquents were increasingly understood to be individual, usually white kids gone astray, while gangs were ethnically or racially identified groups of kids defending and violating ethno-racial boundaries. In Changing Course, Preventing Gang Membership, it says, the connection between race, ethnicity, and gang membership has long existed. Early gang members traditionally came from white ethnic immigrant groups such as the Irish and Polish, whereas starting in the 1950s, we have seen gang membership increasingly concentrated among racial minorities such as African Americans, Hispanics, Asians, and American Indians. There have been waves of gang formation, and it's fair to say that West Side Story does have credibility when it comes to Puerto Rican youth gang, incrementing around the 1950s. But it wasn't just Puerto Ricans. There were other Latin American nationalities, blacks, and even whites. Yet the numbers are cloudy. What we do know is that gangs tend to form when there is a high rise in public housing setting and the first phase of cultural diffusion, either migrating from another country or another part of the country, like when the Great Migration drove blacks to the north of the US. Experts increasingly characterize the gang problem as a usually racial conflict among the urban underclass. In the background of all of this, Oja writes, West Side Story premiered in a volatile stretch of American racial history. In 1954, the Supreme Court declared the widespread practice of segregating public schools to be unconstitutional in Brown versus the Board of Education, and in 1955, Rosa Parks famously refused to move to the color section of a bus, provoking the Montgomery bus boycott. The civil rights movement gained momentum steadily, with major events happening in close proximity to West Side Story's opening on Broadway. Barrios writes, when Lawrence proposed to Bernstein that there might be a way to revive East Side Story, they took the cue from the California stories and changed its hostilities from Jews versus Catholics to Latinos against Anglos. It soon became still more specific for these two New Yorkers, the gangs then active on Manhattan's west side, with recent arrivals from Puerto Rico opposing the descendants of earlier immigrants from Europe. The play was written by a Jew, composed by 2 Jews, choreographed by a Jew, and considering it initially wanted to be a play about religious intolerance, Jews against Catholics, one can help but wonder how Lawrence, Sondheim, Bernstein, and Robbins were searching to tell a tale about intolerance, which strikes a chord with their identity mostly as Jews, although they were also gay men. Bernstein and Robbins practiced what you might call complicated bisexuality according to various sources. Stephen Whitfield writes, the creative Jews most responsible for both the play and the movie might have found especially apt the disturbing themes of rancor and resentment, which led native-born punks to defend their turf against darker-hued newcomers. Working to revise a Broadway genre that had already distanced itself from the flippery of Viennese operetta and of German student princes, the filmmakers thus wanted to help make America safe for diversity. They used West Side Story to tell a story with a recurring theme in their lives as Jewish queer men, and it seemed that whichever group was otherized didn't matter how it was portrayed or represented as much as the central themes of the story did. In fact, Sondheim admitted he didn't know any Puerto Rican prior to composing the lyrics of the songs for West Side Story. In 1957, West Side Story opened on Broadway. The audience enthusiasm did not translate unreservedly to the critical community. It's well known that West Side Story did not generate universal raves after it opened, to the point that it has become a signal example of a major work that audiences may have comprehended ahead of critics. The buzz that season was The Music Man, which went on to win 6 Tony Awards, including Outstanding Musical. Theater critic Brooks Atkinson of The Times, a man who will make or break a show with a few sentences, said, "Although the material is horrifying, the workmanship is admirable."
Mr. Lawrence, have you had a chance to read the reviews?
I've read 2 of them.
Which ones were those?
Mr. Atkinson in the Times and Kerr in the Tribune.
And how do you feel about them?
Mr. Atkinson was a wonderful review.
A rave, I might say.
Yes, it was. And I thought very discerning.
I will fill in on the lack of comment on the Kerr review. My personal opinion was it was less than a great review. I think he is in the absolute minority in the city this morning. How did...
I don't mind saying, I know it's considered...
Not cricket?
Not cricket to criticize a critic. I almost said a cricket. But...
long and happy run, and I know you'll have one.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Critics commented how unrealistic and unbelievable the show was. Nationally recognized physician Howard Rusk wrote in the Sunday Times about the one single lyric of America that turned Puerto Rico an island of tropic diseases. To make his point, he stated that malaria in Puerto Rico had been all but eradicated, and that the recent numbers showed the island's overall death rate to have declined dramatically. This pejorative insinuated that Puerto Rican migrants pose a threat to public health. Sondheim changed the lyrics when it came time for the film version. The following year, 1958, the film rights were sold to then an independent company, Seven Arts Production, and the development of the film version started. The casting for the film was a difficult task. It was true for the stage version years before. For the stage, Barrios writes, "Most of the performers cast as Puerto Rican characters reflected the conventions of the time by being mostly non-Hispanic, with Chita Rivera as the most conspicuous exception. Down the line, all the characters were cast with dancer, actors, singers who could blossom under the Jerome Robbins brand of leadership, smart, rigorous, and tough. The same can be said of the film's casting. There were 35 main roles, most of them with challenging and somewhat seemingly daunting requirements. If anything was Robbins was exigent, intensely demanding, so much that he slowed the production down because he'd do take after take after take until it was, to his standards, at least decent. I feel confident enough in saying that this man didn't know the word perfection and that it was just never good enough. This dragged the filming schedule and the money, as 70mm film was, to quote Harold Mirisch, one of the executive producers of the film, in a letter he sent to both directors Weiss and Robbins, fantastically expensive. Very few of the performers considered for the leading roles were capable of singing Bernstein's music, and those playing Puerto Rican on screen were not required to possess any kind of Latin heritage. For many modern observers, both dub voices and Hispanic makeup and accents may seem unsettling or distracting. This, in the end, were 2 areas in which the filmmakers were content to follow traditions and practices that had been in place for many years. In fact, for the role of Maria, women from all over the globe were considered. Hong Kong, Israel, Italy. One of the best known finalists was Susan Conner, who is half Mexican. The list also included Audrey Hepburn, Natalie Wood, Anne Bancroft, Ina Balin, and Marisa Pavan. The Latin Americans who ended up in the film, aside from Rita Moreno, more on her later, were Chino, played by Jose de Vega, half Filipino, half Colombian, Jay Norman, part Puerto Rican, plays Pepe. We have Mexican-born Nico Rosevich as Toro, Rudy del Campo as Feeling Enough, and Jaime Rogers as Loco. 4 of the Shark Girls were also of Hispanic descent: Yvonne Othon, Maria Jimenez, Linda Dancil, and Olivia Perez. Besides this, the eventual Shark men and women came from backgrounds that included Russian, Greek, Turkish, European Jewish, and Japanese American. For the role of Anita, Weiss interviewed the fabulous Chita Rivera, who originated the role. She might have been more in the running had she not been already involved with Bye Bye Birdie. After a career of playing every other non-white ethnicity on screen and a large amount of Latina spitfire, playing Anita was one of the best opportunities Moreno had received in a long time, although there were doubts, especially her dancing skills, which Moreno knew were up to Rivera's level, but after reading for the part several times and doing a screen test, the role was hers. Herrera writes, "The impact of Rivera's casting in the role of Anita endures beyond her original performance and her impact on the shape of the show. Indeed, just as West Side Story's casting aesthetics drew on mid-century practices of casting non-Latinos in Latino roles, so too did Rivera's casting, in a very still Latina way, amplify Anita's confrontation with the powerful pleasures, perils, and problems of the color line." Deborah Paredes notes, Rivera's casting in the role of Anita helped to script the role as a Latina in ways distant from other roles of the period, and even in ways distant from other Latin roles in West Side Story. We can see this legacy manifested in the casting processes for subsequent West Side Story productions, as the show went first to London and then to Hollywood before returning to New York for the 1964 City Center revival. No comparably aggressive recruitment of Latino actors for shark roles appeared to have taken place, but throughout the productions, Anita is unique in having been consistently cast with a Latina performer. The London production was delayed to accommodate Rivera's schedule. Rita Moreno was hired for the film, narrowly beating out Barbaluna, who took on the role at City Center in 1964. The notable exception perhaps proving this rule will be Debbie Allen, who played Anita in the 1980 revival. In the casting notes, Robbins and Wise saw white and non-white, mostly Latin American actors for the roles of the sharks, but, distinctly as Herrera puts it, no Latino actors appear to have been considered for roles as members of the Jets. Francis Negron Montaigne arcs, West Side Story is nothing short of a Puerto Rican birth of a nation, a blatant seminal, pun intended, valorized, anesthetized eruption into the American national consciousness. Although Robbins resisted the idea that he was quote-unquote documenting, it wasn't difficult for critics and audiences to think West Side Story was a mirror of current sociological issues occurring in the country, but especially in New York City, where it rendered more plausivity thanks to the burgeoning Puerto Rican migration and teenage gangs. Correlation but not causation here, people. Herrera writes, reviewers and audiences alike lauded West Side Story's presumed sociological accuracy. The Daily Mirror proclaimed West Side Story a thriller as up to the minute as tomorrow's headlines. It became a work of art that could offer, and I'm using air quotes here, representation and even a solution to New York City's social problems. In a letter to the New York Times, arts editors, theatergoers Gary Smith and Barry Frank wonder whether the dramatic social significance of West Side Story might serve some practical purpose. Could special maintenance sponsored by the city be given for high school audiences? Some of our teenagers might benefit from such a surge in creative and entertaining treatment of their problems. One Broadway historian later observed, in 1957 the gang warfare and rioting which dominated the show may have seemed far-fetched to New York theater audiences, still unwilling to admit that such conditions were reality rather than fancy. 10 years later, however, even the skeptics realized that West Side Story could almost be called a documentary portrayal. Herrera's thesis in his chapter of Latin numbers, How the Sharks Became Puerto Rican, states that West Side Story perhaps inadvertently, but nonetheless importantly, addressed an uncertainty among the U.S. cultural elite regarding how the new Puerto Rican arrivals in New York should be understood, especially with regard to existing racial structures and hierarchies. Were the Puerto Ricans arriving from the island to the mainland like previous generations of European immigrants through the Golden Door of Ellis Island, or whether the dark-skinned migrants like African Americans of the Great Migration from the American South. Indeed, more African Americans were moving to the north, and the intermingling of races, especially in metropolis, were inevitable. Yet segregation and civil rights were conversations that politicians, activists, and citizens were starting to reckon with. And as we know, non-white characters were often otherized. They were sidelined explicitly and sometimes implicitly. West Side Story is not the exception here. Let's see the many ways the film treats its non-white characters. First, we have the opening of the film, which opens with the very cool, menacing jets. They work collectively, yet one can help to notice that each has individuality. Herrera says, while the script and score do invest Riff, Diesel, Baby John, and Anybody's with idiosyncratic characterizations, the musical relies on the Jets as an ensemble character to propel the drama of its plot. Indeed, by most measures, the Jets are rightly read as West Side Story's protagonists. Compelled by their conflict with the Sharks and catalyzed by Tony's betrayal of his identity as a Jet, the crisis over whether and how the Jets will survive this West Side Night, with or without Tony, coordinates the musical to every dramatic beat and also cues how the Jets activate the drama of race within West Side Story. Each member of the Jets its name and gets either a speech, a line, a song, or a combination of the three. And they have three songs that speaks to their different predicaments. There is the Jet song, which defines their identity as basically entitled white men, and that gang affiliation answers to all needs in life. Then there's also Cool and G Officer Krupke, the latter one being controversial for its critique of the juridical system, how social welfare criminalizes typical youth behavior, and fails to understand the root cause of delinquency.
Is that your name?
Yeah.
Krupke?
Mm-hmm.
Really?
Yeah, Matt Krupke.
You're Officer Krupke.
I am.
Familiar with West Side Story?
No, sir.
What? There's a character in West Side Story named Officer Krupke.
Okay.
You're Officer Krupke. You never heard the song?
No, sir.
Oh, Officer Krupke, what are we to do? Gee, Officer Krupke, crop you. You never heard that?
No.
No?
No.
By the way, they wanted to say fuck you, but in the 50s
Oh,
on
wow.
Broadway, Sondheim, he couldn't write fuck you. So crup you is a substitute for fuck you. Has anybody ever said crup you?
No.
Huh.
Some guy told me to go fuck my face once. He went to jail.
Okay.
While the song fails to convey, and perhaps the problem starts with giving the song to be sung by the Jets instead of the Sharks, it fails to address the racial systemic roots of youth incarceration. Despite being a film about the consequences of hatred and discrimination, people of color are disproportionately incarcerated, so it would only be fair to have given the Sharks a take on this issue. It is the Jets' crisis of survival that compels West Side Story's dramatic action at every turn. Herrera writes, even the question of whether the Jets' co-founder Tony can independently pursue the something he sees coming, or whether he really will remain a Jet to his last dying day, it's part of the Jets' defining struggle as an ensemble character, and adds, the Jets emerge as a cinematic embodiment of whiteness in peril. For the movie Jets, their shared crisis is not so much generational as it is racial, with Tony's betrayal anchored by the anti-raciality of his romance with Maria. Within this cinematic depiction, as Julia Fox and others have convincingly demonstrated, the Jets' solidarity becomes the cool face guarding the increasingly urbanized color line from those threatening to violate that racialized border, the Sharks. The Sharks, on the other hand, were seen as a mere prop to modernize Romeo and Juliet. Aside from Bernardo and Chino, no other character speaks or sings a song of their own except two counterpoint quintet. Maria, Anita, and the other Shark girls are dynamic presence, both physically and vocally, but do little with one exception, to compel the action of the story, even as they contribute some of the show's most diverting numbers. Behind the scenes of the film, Robin subjected his cast to not mix. Jets ought to be with other Jets, Sharks with Sharks, on and off camera. Barrios writes that he encouraged competition and segregation, even animosity between the two gang groups, correctly believing that this gave the dancing heightened vigor and conviction. Now let's focus on Chino for a moment, shall we? And I'm going to speak about spoilers, so if you haven't seen this movie, well, what are you even doing here? Sorry. Anyway, Chino is the most transformed character in the West Side Story 1961 film adaptation. He goes from defending Maria's choice to dance with Tony at the gym to becoming a defender of Bernardo's and, in a way, Maria's honor, killing Tony. Chino also becomes the shark whose proclaimed pursuit of vengeance against Tony creates a current of tensions that compels West Side Story's final arc of dramatic action, both on stage and on film. The concluding image of the film tells a different story, however, one that wasn't scripted either by Lawrence or Leham. In the final scene, we see a procession funeral style occurring in which Tony's body is being carried out of screen, followed by Maria, the Jets, and the Sharks, who walk in different directions. Finally, Chino is led away by Lieutenant Shrunk and Officer Krupke, thereby composing the film's concluding dramatic action, a Latino gang member being taken into custody. On stage, Chino's transformation, innocent turned murderer, is of a piece with West Side Story's many accidental devastations. Maria learning to hate, the rumble turning deadly, and Anita's assault. Wise film, however, scripts a specific future for Chino. We don't know what's going to happen to any of the other characters. We don't even know where Anita is. But we know one thing for sure. Chino is going to jail. Wise's addition of a clearly criminal future for Chino in his film adaptation of West Side Story garnered no special attention from either his collaborators or the film's many commentators, either at the time of the film's release or in the half-century since. To be sure, Chino's implied incarceration is a tiny detail that comes only in the very last moments of our long and complex film. Even so, the fact that Chino's impending incarceration is rendered so simply signals not only the historical distance between the stage musical premiere in 1957 and the film's success in 1961, but also West Side Story's perhaps inadvertent influence on depictions of Puerto Rican youth in US popular performance in those intervening years. In between the stage and the film version, numerous articles describe the narrative of Puerto Rican youth criminality. These journalistic accounts reminded that not only a boy like Bernardo might have died on the street last night, but also that a boy like Chino or Jose or Salvador might be seeking vengeance right now. To this, Herrera writes, Chino's cinematic recharacterization, intended with other narratives charting the entry of Puerto Rican boys into criminal lives, emerged as perhaps the inaugural appearance of one of the most enduring stock characters in subsequent depictions of Latino masculinity in US popular performance, the Latino gang member, which leads me to discuss more gender issues. Anita leads America on both stage and screen, but Broadway's America is not the same as Hollywood's. The theatrical version of America is a diversion, showing Anita and the other Shark girls cutting up after their boyfriends leave for something called a war console with the Jets. Movies America is an argument. The Shark girls, as led by Anita, express their knowing enthusiasm for a life away from the island of Puerto Rico. The Sharks themselves rebut with anger and resentment regarding the many hostilities and daily humiliations they face on the mainland. The stage America resolves as the women dance together, while the culminating dance in the screen's America confirm the intransigence of the conflict between the Sharks and the Jets. Versions of America both reveal and confirm some of the specific ways in which the Sharks' raciality was amplified in West Side Story's adaptation from stage to screen. Before the American numbers started shooting, to much dismay by the cast, MJ Studios fired Robbins as the film's co-director because of creative differences. De Niro stepped in to finalize the staging of the new American number under the supervision of the remaining half of the film's directing team, Robert Wise. The result is an America that pits West Side Story's Puerto Rican community against itself in a battle of the sexes, one in which the women affirm assimilation's promise of futurity, even as the men confirm the miry ways in which poverty and racism reveal the falsity of that assurance. The song America not only defines the cultural differences that exist between Tony and Maria, but it also taps into the gender difference. By reframing the song's central disagreement as a gender conflict wherein the women want to stay in America While the men want no part of it, the filmmakers also situate the sharks within a well-rehearsed tradition of racializing U.S. depictions of Latin American masculinity as backward, savage, and almost pathological, rooted in tradition, especially in contrast to Anglo or Euro-American masculinity. The tragic collision wrought by their love on screen, therefore, becomes a more explicitly racial cautionary tale of the perils of interracial heterosexual contact. In its review, Newsweek had compared the close-ups of Tony and Maria to Mount Rushmore. Let's face it, the movie is iconic as its groundbreaking elements weigh against its outdated and aged ones. That doesn't mean we're not allowed to criticize something we love. In fact, we love it so much, we wish it was better. In a way, we're thankful it gave us Rita Moreno, whom even Puerto Rican Jennifer Lopez admire, having watched the film, according to Vanity Fair, 37 times. Commenting, "I never wanted to be that wimpy Maria who sits around pining for her guy. I wanted to be Anita, who danced her way to the top." Some improvements have been made in the past few years as cultural appropriation and racial sensitivity permeates more the corners of society at large. In 2009, Lin-Manuel Miranda translated the lyrics of the songs into Spanish. The shark roles also calls for Latin American descent actors only, a rule it is for the most part respected now, and which seems to be fixed in the upcoming Steven Spielberg remake. I think it's important to call out these subtle issues because film is such a representational medium. Who would have thought a movie about Puerto Ricans written by a group of white men will have any blind spots? I'm curious to see how Spielberg's film tackles the story and whether it perpetrates on stereotypes that relate to current issues such as cultural sensitivity, racial profiling, and economic and gender inequality. West Side Story has remained fresh in people's mind more than many other Best Picture winners because it is an open dialogue between racially divided groups and see a path to greater harmony between new immigrants and longtime residents. 6 decades later, these problems all persist, and if awareness has been hiding for many, some woods of division have become even more raw. Its everlasting beauty include the music and lyrics, the choreography, and its willingness to not turn false on a typical happy Hollywood ending, promising a solution where none can be found.